Hi guys, it's Grandpa again. In our last chapter, chapter 17, Poppy had done something really stupid. She had walked out into the road where she wasn't protected by the corn, and she trusted Mr. Okax, and that was a bad choice because now he is up in the air. He is swooping down, about to grab her as she is standing in the road. And we are on chapter 18 today, 1-8, and it's called The Battle. It was Ragweed's earring that saved her. So powerful, so swift was Mr. Okax's descent, that means him coming down out of the air, that he pushed a wave of air before him, which caused that little earring to flutter. The flutter felt like the tap of a tiny finger on Poppy's ear. She felt it, and she whirled around. At the last possible second, she saw that owl coming down out of the air, and she made a leap to safety. The next moment, however, she realized that she had made another terrible mistake. She had leaped, but not towards the corn, but further out onto the open road. Mr. Okax was now on the ground, blocking her way back to the cornfield. She spun around towards the forest. In a split second, the owl was up in the air and down on her other side. Once again, the owl had blocked her way. "Not so smart as all of that, are you?" he sneered. "Well, I don't compromise with what I want," he said. "And what I want is for you never getting home alive." He made a sudden darting movement to the left. Poppy jumped to the right, but Mr. Okax was ahead of her. Just as quickly, he shifted back toward her, so that Poppy was faced to halt herself clumsily. And there she stood, flat-footed, panting, not sure which way she needed to go. The owl, who was towering over the top of her, laughed. "I told you what would happen if I caught up with you again, didn't I? But this time, you won't have that fat porcupine to save you." And so saying, he made a snap at her with his beak. Mr. Okax's mention of Eureth was just the reminder that Poppy needed. She reached down and she yanked that quill out from under her belt, and then she held it out in front of her like a sword. At first, Mr. Okax just blinked. Then he snickered. "You don't think one of his quills is going to stop me, do you?" "That owl on the barn," Poppy panted out between hard breathing, "is just a fake. You've been frightened by a fake owl." Mr. Okax's beak dropped open. He hesitated. In that moment, Poppy sensed that she could have gotten away, but she could not resist just one more taunt. One more comment. "You're not an owl. You're a chicken," she cried in triumph. For an instant, the two of them, owl and mice, confronted each other. Then this look of terrible rage passed across the owl's face. Poppy knew then she had made another blunder, another bad mistake. She had lost her momentary chance of escape. Now there was nothing that he'd not do to kill her. She was going to have no choice. She was going to have to fight him. And here's a picture of that. Mr. Okax. And he is ready to jump on little Poppy and kill her. Trembling, she flourished that quill in the air. In response, Mr. Okax spread his wings then beat down hard with them upon the road. They threw up a cloud of dust. It was now hard for Poppy to breathe, much less see. She took a step back, only to hear a sound behind her. Confused, she turned around. Hidden by the dust, Mr. Oacax had overleaped the road, so once again he was behind her. From there he made a slash at her with his beak. Poppy stuck out her quill. Well, seeing the quill and realizing the danger to his eyes, the owl backed up. He glared at Poppy. He snapped his beak. Poppy stared back, grim-faced, gasping for breath, waving that quill out in front of her. "If this takes the whole night, I'll wear you down," Mr. Oacax hissed. "All it's gonna take is one mistake on your part. Then you're done. You're finished." He made a forward move. Poppy danced nimbly backwards. Mr. Oacax struck at her again. This time it was not with his beak, but with his talons. Poppy, with her quill up, dodged the talons with a quick sidestep, but she knew her only hope was to get back into that cornfield and hide. Otherwise, it was just a matter of time, and that owl was going to overpower her. Making sure of her footing, she began to back up towards the forest, and just as she had hoped, Mr. Oacax leaped up and landed between her and the trees. It was then that she made a race for the corn. But Mr. Oacax was just as fast. Grasping her strategy, he barely touched the ground when he took a flying hop forward to block her way to the cornfield. He advanced wildly now, snapping and snarling at her. In response, Poppy slashed wildly with her quill. Once, she struck out at the owl's face, but she only hit feathers. But through the blow, though the blow glanced off harmlessly, it only served to infuriate him, made him madder. Mr. Oacax, closing in, darted his head in and out, side to side. Poppy was bewildered. She was confused. Then the owl turned briefly away from her. In a flash, she made a successful rolling dive underneath his wing. She was now behind Mr. Oacax at last, on the corn side of the road. She started to run. He turned his head in a complete half circle, saw her, and spun his whole body around. His right wing extended at its full length. The wingtip struck Poppy a blow across her head. Down she tumbled, and she landed on her back in the dust. Seizing his opportunity, Mr. Oacax pounced with his beak wide open, his tongue out, hissing. Poppy whipped the air with that quill. The tip of it poked the owl's tongue. He screamed in rage and he reeled back. Poppy had just enough time to get back onto her feet. Once more she was facing him, with her quill at the ready. Mr. Oacax, stung, pressed forward now, this way, then that way, his head bobbing, weaving, viciously snapping with his beak. Increasingly exhausted, Poppy was forced to give ground. She crumpled to her knees. It was the moment that the owl had been waiting for. With a powerful kick, he thrust out his left claw, talons spread wide, right at Poppy's head. Poppy saw that claw coming at her. Using all of her strength to grip that quill, she held it up with both paws to protect herself, and she jabbed it into Mr. Okax's claw as that claw came down. The owl gave a great squawk. He fell back and began to roll about on the ground violently. Fearful of losing her quill, her only weapon, Poppy pulled on it with all of her might. But those barbs had caught. She could not pull the quill out. She was being dragged and bumped around now by holding on. Mr. Okax, screeching and flapping his wings wildly, flailed into the air. And before Poppy knew what was happening, she too was up in the air. She did tell herself, "Let go of the quill." But by the time she thought it was whole, it was too late. To drop now from this height that Mr. Okax had already reached meant a certain fall to a certain death. There was nothing she could do now but hang on to that quill. Mr. Okax, squawking, hissing, flew like one possessed. Up, down, around, making loops and dives, climbing and twisting, anything and everything to try to get that quill out of his claw. But the more he flexed and twisted, the more those barbs worked themselves into his claw ever deeper, causing him even more tremendous pain. Poppy hung on. The fact that Mr. Okax was dragging a claw, and from that claw dangled a mouse, greatly impeded his flying, made it hard for him to fly. His flight path became increasingly wild. In his desperate desire to get rid of the pain, Mr. Okax ceased to look where he was going. And here's a picture of Okax flying with little Poppy hanging onto that quill, flying in the air with him. Violently, he plunged down towards the cornfield. Once over the cornfield, he lowered his left claw, and that meant lowering Poppy, deliberately thumping it and her along the corn stalks in the hope that that quill would be jerked out. Poppy was now being battered by the corn, but each time she decided to release her hold on the quill, the owl surged forward, causing her to cling to it even more than ever. Knowing she was not going to be able to take much more, Poppy tried to see ahead. Mr. Okax was now flying low over the corn tops, but when he passed beyond the corn, he was now dropping down towards the ground. "Let go," Poppy told herself. "Let go of the quill." But she was feeling so groggy, her muscles would not listen or respond. Then she saw it. She saw what that owl was aiming for. He was flying towards the salt lick, and he was picking up speed. In his madness, he was preparing to strike his claw on that block of salt. Poppy had wits enough to sense that if she got smacked into that hard salt, it would be the end of her. "Let go, let go, let go," she cried to herself. But this time she did, and down to the ground she plummeted. As she did this, Mr. Okax first rose, and then he dropped. Totally out of control now, he slammed into that salt head first. So great was the blow that salt shattered, while the owl went tumbling head over tail in an explosion of feathers. After 3 flips in the air, he flopped down like a sack of potatoes onto the ground. As for Poppy, she had landed on the grass. For a moment she just lay there, stunned, battered, and confused. She looked up into the sky, but she could see nothing. Then she looked down across the lawn. It was then that she saw him. Mr. Oakax, laying on his back, perfectly still. His claws were now drawn up over his chest, slightly curled. That quill was still stuck in his left foot. Scattered about him and among the feathers were chunks of salt. Poppy stumbled to her feet. She took a wobbly step or two towards the cornfield. Then she stopped and looked back. Mr. Oakax had still not moved. She stared towards him. Surely, not sure if she should believe what she was thinking, she crept closer to the fearsome owl. After every few steps, she would pause, look, and sniff. Still, there was no movement. Close to Mr. Oakax's head now, Poppy stopped again. The owl's great eyes were wide open, staring up into the sky. His devil-like tufts of feathers were now bent. His beak was open, and as Poppy watched, his beak snapped listlessly. Mr. Oakax? No answer. She took a step closer. Mr. Oakax? His head turned slightly. For a moment his eyes seemed to focus on her. Sometimes, he murmured, sometimes I wonder why I bother to protect you. And with that, his beak made one final clack shut. His eyes closed. Poppy knew it then. Mr. Oakax was no longer alive. And here's a picture of that. Poppy looking at Mr. Oakax, who is on the ground, and his foot is sticking up in the air with that barb stuck in his foot, that quill stuck in his foot. And that is the end of chapter 18. Mr. Oakax is dead. It's getting good, and it's not over yet. Come back and we'll read some more. Bye. See you later.